Okay.
You're fine. You are fine.
Sure.
There was like a natural lull.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Cool.
Good to see you, man.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. What is I guess no longer a snowy day.
Was a pretty morning though.
It was. So please join me in welcoming today's Colloquium speaker, Seth Blumsack. Before we get to his illustrious background and full introduction, we do have one quick announcement from Ariana. So if you want to go ahead and just tell us.
Yeah.
Comments.
So the before I say it, I think we need to turn on our camera.
It's still not on.
It says recording.
But
sorry.
Thank you.
You're okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
So the Creative Inspiration and the Cultural Commons Working Group is starting a bi-weekly Wednesday breakfast. And so we'll be meeting in the Ostrom room starting on this Wednesday at 9 o'clock. There will be coffee and things to munch on. So join us if you want to talk about the cultural commons and the political and legal governance of creative production. And we have also a practice of going on field trips to different lectures and events around Bloomington, and then afterwards we hang out to discuss them. So if you want to get on the email list to learn about our field trips, just let me know.
Always down.
It's really cool.
Food and field trips.
Yeah.
All right. Exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you, Ariana. Any other quick announcements?
It's a bit of a random one, but we're going to be having 3 or 4 Girl Scout troops coming on Thursday, the February 22nd. There's like this working together unit that they're doing, but we're going to be featuring Lens on Common Life, and they'll be doing some activities, and they'll be baking, there'll be stuff. It'll be adorable. It'll be fun. So if you want to come help out with the Girl Scouts, that'll be going on. In a few weeks. Yeah.
I had a Girl Scout troop when I was here as a graduate student. I can't imagine bringing them to the workshop.
I know.
Put those two together.
I know.
Todd, are they reading your book before they come?
Yeah. So yeah, we're gonna do Emily. We're doing a little reading here, and we'll do the game, like the goldfish overfishing game. It'll be great.
Get snacks and field trips, right?
Yeah, that's it. That's the theme. That's the connection.
All right, great. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Seth Blumsack, who is Professor of Energy Policy and Economics and International Affairs, an Associate Department Head in the, the Department of Energy and Mineral Engineering at Penn State is where he's coming in from. Directs the Center for Energy Law and Policy, also serves as a faculty member in the Ostrom. Oh man, I'm sorry.
We have Ostrom anything at Penn State.
It is not my day today. I'm sorry.
It's already been
Operations program, and is co-director. It's because you have so many titles. That's really fun. Is co-director of the Penn State Energy and Environmental Economics and Policy Initiative. Is also external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, which is actually where I first became aware of your work, listening to their wonderful podcast, and then sort of getting to know all of the really wonderful affiliates, including Seth. This is not actually his first time at IU, but we are delighted that it is your first time at the workshop. So we're really excited to have you here. His work really is really in the real sort of core of interdisciplinarity, I think, that is so celebrated by the workshop. So it's really exciting, the sort of intersection of engineering and environmental economics and policy. So that's really, really exciting. He's published, co-authored or sole authored over 60 articles and book chapters in this area. And my understanding is also we're a journalist before you came to the dark side of academia. So that's wonderful. So I'm going to stop rambling now. Please join me in welcoming Professor Seth Blumsack, who's going to be talking about voting rules and preferences for regional transmission organizations in the energy sector in the US. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and I will keep a queue. I could ask a little bit online, that'd be great. Thank you. But feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. But again, remember, just clarifying questions in the presentation, actual real questions and comments at the end. Sound good?
Okay. That's fine.
Okay.
I feel, it's funny, like, okay, raise your hand or wave, or I don't know, walk out of the room and discuss or do something. If you know anything about how the power grid works, other than you like turn the light switch on and off and something magical happens.
I read the background stuff.
You read the background. All right. Okay. So I want to thank the Ostrom workshop a ton for this invitation. And as part of the conditions of being invited to come here, I had to, basically send you all a paper for you all to read and all of this sort of stuff. But like really, I have like two ulterior motives for coming here. Okay. And they're related. Okay. So one of them is so I have been a student of the electricity industry since like the mid 1990s. Okay, which is just a signal that I have been doing this for way too long and should go do something else in my life. But one of the things about like the power grid is like a cult, right? Like the sort of like the culture of like people who like study and design and like operate the power grid, like it really is like a cult, okay? And it sort of but it's the worst cult ever, right? Because, like a lot of cults have this, had this aim of like sucking other people into the cult, okay? The power grid cult is, it's really designed to like keep people out, right? And so the sort of like the culture of the electricity industry is one that is like very, very insular. But at the same time, I think as we go through this very, very complex process of technology transition in what our grid looks like and what we use electricity for and yada, 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 all this sort of stuff, I think one thing that we really, really need is like new ideas, right? And so like, I think we need people who are not part of the cult to like come in and like give us new ideas. Okay. So that's part of my motivation that's part of my one ulterior motive for coming here, right? Is maybe to say some stuff that just makes you say like either this is so interesting or there is absolutely no way that this is the way that the world actually works and this is crazy. That you might possibly be interested in like allocating some time, especially to the governance of this very, very complex engineered system. And the sort of the second ulterior motive is that I am currently the director of a multi-institution research network called the RTO Governance Research Network, which is basically it's really a research network, right? It's supported by private foundations and stuff, but it's not like a traditional academic project, right? And so we are always looking for new people from various backgrounds to come and get involved in the work that we do and the network. And again, bringing like new ideas from outside of the power grid cult. So if you think that this is, potentially an interesting area, please talk to me. I'll be here for the next couple days. I am obsessive about my email like a good academic. But because I am old, I have no presence online other than my email. So, okay.
Good for you.
All right, so I'm gonna share my screen. I really only have I have a bunch of pictures. I really only have like one or two that I think are actually worth saying. And I feel like a little bit like I should divide this sort of talk into two parts, right? One is like, what on earth is a regional transmission organization, right? And then what did I do in this silly paper that I sent you all and they asked you to read before my talk? Okay. The real reason I got into this work after doing like engineering and optimization and modeling work for years and years and years was to be able to quote The Simpsons in an academic paper. I finally reached the pinnacle of my career in November when I got to quote The Simpsons in a law review paper that I wrote. All right. Okay. So I want to start actually by talking a little bit about what exactly a regional transmission organization is. And if you are one of those people that raised your hands and knows what a regional transmission organization is, then you can like check your email or tune out for a minute or pretend this is like television or whatever. Okay. So, all right. So you all probably know roughly what an electric utility is, right? I'm guessing most of you, unless you are a renter where somebody else pays your power bill, right? You get a bill every month for your electric and you have to pay the bill, or the evil utility is going to like do bad things to you and they have terrible customer service. Okay. For about 100 years, right, the industrial organization of electricity service in the United States was really focused around what we call the vertically integrated electric utility. So they would produce power at big power plants, they would move it long distances over electric transmission lines, and ultimately they would deliver it to you and send you a bill. Okay, and they were very, very heavily regulated by the state in which you lived. So Indiana has some sort of utility commission, right, that would set prices in terms of service and all sorts of stuff for the utility. All right. So about 30 years ago, the United States basically upended this roughly century-old model, okay, and went through this process. Sometimes we call this process deregulation, although it's not really an appropriate word for it, okay? Or that's maybe not the best word for it. But we went through this process of reorganizing large swaths of the electric utility industry in the United States, okay? And part of that was the creation of these entities, okay, called regional transmission organizations, okay? And so there are a bunch of these that cover portions of the US and Canada, okay? So each kind of colored area here is a regional transmission organization. So like, you know, mine is called, the one that covers my area is called PJM. You know, you all are lucky or unlucky, depending on how you want to look at it, and that you have sort of two that cover different parts of your state, okay? And so these are organizations that were created as part of this process of industry restructuring, okay? People spend their entire lives studying these organizations, but ultimately there's only like a couple things that you need to know about them, okay? The first is that they are voluntary organizations, okay? So the federal government or like anybody else did not mandate the creation of these organizations, okay? And so like the white areas that you see here, like in the Southeast and in much of like the Western US, except for California, in those areas, the power grid is still run by the utility, right? The vertically integrated utility, okay? So these are voluntary organizations. Nobody has to form or join one of these regional transmission organizations, okay? The other thing that you need to know about the regional transmission organization is I sort of like to say that if you care about like anything related to electricity, like energy costs, environmental quality, climate, resilience, all this other stuff, okay, then these RTOs, these regional transmission organizations, are the most important organizations that you have never heard of. Because unless something really, really bad happens, okay, they basically operate very much out of the public eye, okay? But what they do is that they were created, again, voluntarily, okay, by aggregating all of the transmission assets of a bunch of old utilities. Okay, so like as an example, the PJM RTO here, right, is now basically one kind of regional power grid that is run by this organization called PJM. It used to be like 22 or 23 much more local power grids that were all interconnected, okay, and there was some level of coordination among the utilities, but they were really run by like 22 or 23 separate entities, Okay, and so basically what the regional transmission organization does is it is it is regulated by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Okay, they all RTOs, they all do things a little bit differently, but they all share the same fundamental mission, which is reliability, like avoiding blackouts. Okay, that's the primary mission of the Regional Transmission Organization. Okay, and so what the Regional Transmission Organization does is it does a lot of the stuff that utilities used to do, right? And in these white areas, the utilities still do. Okay, so the decision about like which power plants are going to run like right now so that we can have this this colloquium talk, right? Those decisions are made by those decisions are made by the RTO. So in this case, it would be the Mid-Continent ISO. Okay. A lot of the kind of like the planning studies, like figuring out like how many new power plants we need, where we want to build transmission lines, all this sort of stuff. Okay. That's all done on this regional basis by the RTO. The utilities don't do this stuff anymore. Okay. All right. So they do a lot of the same things that that utilities used to do. But here's the catch. Okay. The utility, like the old utility, which had this mission, basically this mission to provide reliable electric service, owned power plants and transmission lines and all of this sort of stuff. Okay. The RTO owns nothing. They own literally nothing. Okay. They don't own power plants. They don't own transmission. They own nothing. All right. So they basically, they are responsible for the reliable operation of this very complex system containing a whole bunch of really, really expensive toys that they don't own. Okay. All right. And so they don't own anything and they can't directly invest in anything. All right. And so yes, you can interrupt.
Clarification.
Yeah.
So if they don't own it, who's on their board?
So I'll get to that in just a second. Okay, like that's a really good question. Just sort of hold that thought for a second. Okay. All right. So they don't own anything. Okay. And so all of the actual physical assets that are located within their footprints are owned by various kinds of entities, right? So you have companies that own power plants and operate power plants. You have companies that operate transmission lines. You have the companies that basically provide like the last mile of electric service. This is the company that actually sends you your bill. Okay, all sorts of different basically different asset owners like that. Okay, and so basically the quandary for the RTO is that they have to figure out how to get the owners of these assets to actually provide services in order to keep them both now and in the future. Okay. And by and large, the way that the RTOs have chosen to do this is through the use of markets. Okay. Or things that through the use of markets or things that look kind of like markets, right? And we can talk more about that later, if you would like, okay? And so kind of what, and again, because the RTOs are voluntary and because, FERC has not been very heavy-handed in telling the RTOs how to do, basically how to achieve their mission, okay? They're, like PJM does not do things in exactly the same way as MISO or Texas or California, okay? But one of the things they all have in common is that a kind of major tool that the RTOs use to get these asset owners to provide services is the use of markets, right? And the idea is that you give the owners of these assets like a financial incentive, okay, to basically, to support the operation of the grid, which is like definitely a common pool resource. All right. And that's, and so that's basically kind of like how it would be organized, right? And so it's, you know, if you're like a Cosian, this is super interesting, right? If you're, you know, I mean, if you're like a polycentric governance person, this is also super interesting. Because so actually I'm gonna stop there for just a second, and maybe this is a little, and just ask if like, are there any kind of like basic questions about what RTOs are or what they do?
Where do they get their revenue?
Where do they get their revenue? That's a great question. They get their revenue from all of us, okay? So ultimately, what funds the RTO, okay? And what the RTO basically has to pay for is its staff, okay? And basically running its buildings, right? So so like the RTOs have buildings, right? That where the staff work and where like the control center for the grid is. Okay. And
those incentives.
I'm sorry?
Those incentives, you say you use markets, do they pay that or they're just intermediaries?
So the RTOs are just intermediaries. Okay. So what funds the RTOs is whether you realize it or not, you have a little slice of your electric bill that basically you pay to your utility, and then the utility pays it to the RTO. And then if you're like the owner of a power plant and you want to play in these super cool RTO markets, you basically have to pay an entrance fee. Okay, that's basically where the revenue comes from. Okay, the RTOs themselves are nonprofit organizations. All right, and so if you sort of think about if you sort of think about like how the money flows, okay, basically the RTO is like a big clearinghouse, okay? So power suppliers, right, they provide the RTO with electricity or wires or whatever, and they get paid money, okay? And then the distribution utilities, right, they take power and ultimately distribute it to all of us, okay? And they give the RTO money, right? And so the idea is that it's sort of all of these things are supposed to balance out. Okay. In reality, there are times when RTOs actually have big surpluses and big deficits, right? And then they have to figure out how to make those wash.
So the RTO is almost like a transaction cost engineer between suppliers and the distributors?
Yes. You could, yes. Mm-hmm. Basically.
And just getting onto the sort of what the rest of the paper goes, which is to do the voting mechanism.
Yeah.
Any one of those producers or suppliers or builders of lines or whatever, any one of those actors, so long as they pay this entrance fee, is officially a voting member. One of those 5 industry sectors that you bring up, right? That's how they become a voting member.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, okay.
Is there any actors in each of these regions that are not part of?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So, okay. So now let me get onto the governance piece. Okay. So, in addition, okay. So these organizations were created. They are regulated by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They are not regulated by the states. Okay, the states have no regulatory authority over these things, okay, which is another interesting topic. All right. FERC, the approach that FERC has taken for many, many years is basically to provide sort of guidance to the RTOs on how they want the RTOs to operate, but not to be very prescriptive. Okay. And so one of the areas where FERC has provided some guidance, okay, which has largely come through a couple of FERC orders. One is Order 2000, one is 714, if you want to look up all the legally stuff, okay? It is that FERC has provided guidance to the RTOs on governance, okay? Which is, and so the way what that guidance looks like is a set of several kind of loosely defined principles. Okay, so like one of the principles, to get to your question a minute ago, is that the board of the RTO is supposed to be financially independent of any commercial interest in the RTO. Right.
So is the board, you said it was nonprofit, is the board paid for their service, or are they truly a nonprofit where it's voluntary contributions? So is the voting that you're going to be talking about voting to be on the board?
No. So the board members, they are paid for their time. They get basically a stipend. Okay. Okay. But it's one of the things about these organizations that's important to realize is that they all sort of approach governance a little bit differently. Okay. And because basically kind of the approach that FERC takes in general, okay, to these sort of organizations is, you know, here's something that we want you to do. So we'll give you a set of guidelines, okay? And then you come up with a proposal for implementing those guidelines, bring it to us, okay? And we, FERC, will decide if it's okay, if it's consistent with the guidance that we gave you. All right? All right. So, so FERC has given the RTOs all of this guidance around governance, okay? And one area, like one specific area of this guidance was basically to require that RTOs engage in some form of what we now call polycentric governance, okay? All right, FERC did not call it this. FERC did not explain what this means. Okay, instead they left it to the RTOs to basically decide. All right, okay, and so each of the RTOs has a different way of implementing this. Okay, broadly, how the RTOs have interpreted FERC's guidance, okay, is that the RTOs have all of these rules about how their markets work, how their planning works, just all of these operational and planning rules, okay? And in deciding on those rules, okay, they get input from a group of organizations that they call stakeholders, okay? And then the stakeholders in different ways voice support or opposition to new rules, okay? And then basically once the board sees the view of the stakeholders, then the board gets to decide if they want to support this rule, which means they send it to FERC for approval, or not support it, which means it basically dies.
Where was the origin of the rule? Who originated the rule?
Okay, so this is where you get into differences among RTOs, okay? Because each RTO has somewhere between slightly and very different view of who is a stakeholder, okay? Just sort of as an example, like in my area, PJM, okay, the stakeholders they're all market actors, right? So they're not necessarily all asset owners, right? Some of them are like basically banks and other people that are involved on the financial side, right? They're all market actors, okay? So like states, environmental organizations, they don't count, okay? They can complain all they want, okay, but they don't get a vote, all right? So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is California, okay, where literally anybody can be a stakeholder, okay? Like literally anybody can be a stakeholder and can provide input on some rule, okay? The catch is in California, the only voting happens at the board level, okay? So, okay, so there's this big spectrum of who is a stakeholder and how much formal authority do they have, all right? All right, and there's also a spectrum in terms of where these rule proposals come from, okay? So and there's a spectrum. So in like PJM, New York, and New England, kind of the northeastern RTOs, okay, the proposals all come from stakeholders. Okay, so if there's a rule, or if there's going to be a rule change, that process has to be initiated by a stakeholder. Okay, and then all the way over here in California has sort of on the other end of the spectrum, which is where, and California is a little different because it's basically, it's a single state RTO that was created by statute, right? Like the state of California basically told its utilities that they were going to form this thing. All right. So in California, these rule changes either come again through statute, right? Through an act of the state legislature or through an initiative of the RTO staff. All right. And so you just, there's, you know, and then, you know, in the kind of in the Midwestern RTOs here, they're sort of somewhere in the middle, right? Because the governance structures in these RTOs have involved like the state regulators a lot more actively than in the Northeast, right? And so there's a lot more like collaborative governance in the Midwestern RTOs that involves the state regulators. Okay.
So one clarification is like, do they set prices or not?
Who is they?
These organizations.
These organizations.
Different organizations, or in some cases they do, and in some others they don't.
So I have to say this very carefully. Okay, so the RTOs calculate wholesale prices. Okay, so like basically like the wholesale price of power is calculated by the RTOs. It's calculated basically using this auction mechanism, right? So like the RTO has kind of a transparent method that it uses to determine what the prices are. Yes.
So what are the markets exactly? So there's a market for the original power that is price controlled to some degree. And then there's the retail market where you and I are paying something. Yeah. Are there markets between those?
Yes.
And also, let's say, can a power company or somebody who's a member of PJM sell power outside of that area to New York or Vermont or whatever?
So the answer to the second question is easy. That's yes. As long as they pay the membership fee, okay, to become a market actor in New York. Okay. So the markets themselves are they're pretty complex, but at the wholesale side, right, you can think of there being sort of two flavors. Okay, one is a spot market for electric energy. Okay, so the RTO needs a whole bunch of electricity to be produced an hour from now. Okay, where's it going to come from, right? Okay, we call that the energy market. Okay, the other one, which is the focus of the paper, is and this is going to sound super weird because the only other industry that I can think of that even has anything close to this is the natural gas pipeline sector. Okay, but there's also a market for what is called capacity. Okay, and the idea is that it's a separate market for just having functional steel in the ground. All right, and that's a forward market. All right, and so the idea behind the capacity market is that if like the RTO forecasts electricity demand for like 3 years from now, right, and they think that they're going to need more power plants in order to meet that future electricity demand, okay, how are they going to get people to build more power plants? How are they going to provide an incentive for the owner of the existing power plant not to shut down? Okay, all right, and unlike a lot of other commodities, right, electricity does not have a very functional or liquid forward market, right? So like if you look at like crude oil, right, or wheat or hog bellies or something like that, right, you have like really, really liquid futures markets for these commodities, but you don't for electricity. All right. And so what the RTO, in order to basically provide these incentives, okay, for basically for getting new power generation and for keeping existing power plants operable, right, has a separate market with a separate payment for basically for capacity. Okay, so so those are those are sort of like the kind of the two markets, right? And the focus of the paper is really on the capacity market, in part because the capacity market has been incredibly controversial, at least within like the cult of the power grid. Okay, because it, you know, the capacity in terms of like your overall electric bill, okay, basically the portion of your electric bill that represents the wholesale cost of power, okay, about maybe like 2/3 of that is the energy market, the actual cost to run the grid, and the other third is this capacity market, okay, which is payments to power generators, whether they ever produce any electricity or not. Okay, and so they're incredibly controversial in part because they're seen as like a windfall to power plants, and in part because there are some people who not unreasonably view them as very, very generous subsidies for plants with very poor environmental performance. Okay, that we basically pay to keep around basically for reasons of avoiding blackouts. Okay, and that's like the one sentence version of the controversy, right? But it's.
Can I just interrupt? I want to make sure we've had lots of clarifying questions because there's just a lot to know about this, I think. But I also want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to discuss all the really fascinating results in the paper. Yeah. So if there's a way to sort of like wrap up in the next few minutes, so we have a little bit of time for that. I don't know.
Yeah. So on the paper, okay. The three RTOs in the Northeast, right? They convey a great deal of formal authority on their stakeholders to formulate these market rules, okay, and then to support or not support them. All right. And so each of these three, they basically have a system for devising and voting on market rules that in some ways looks a lot like the structure of the US Congress, right? So basically you have committees where the rules are formed, then the rules come out of committee and they go to the full set of stakeholders, okay? And then the stakeholders vote on them, all right? And the way that and again, not every RTO uses this voting system, but these three do, okay? And the stakeholders in these three RTOs have a tremendous amount of authority and power, okay, to formulate the rules for the grid, which again affects everything from cost to environmental quality to reliability, okay? And so the way that these, so like the way that voting happens in these three RTOs is through a process called sector-weighted voting, okay, which mathematically is no different than the Electoral College that we use for presidential elections. All right. So the way that it works is that the way that the sector-weighted voting system works is that each stakeholder, right, basically picks or is assigned basically a sector, like power generation, power transmission, end use, electricity user. Okay. And so those are like the equivalent of the states, right, within the Electoral College system. All right. And then when stakeholders vote, okay, each sector basically gets a certain number of, basically gets a certain weight or a certain number of like electoral votes. Okay. And so whether a proposal passes, whether a rule change in an RTO passes or not, right, basically depends on whether you get enough equivalent of the electoral votes. Okay, so there's this threshold that each of the RTOs has, and so this system has the sort of like the combination of the sector-weighted voting system and the definition of the sectors themselves, right, has given basically kind of can shift political power, right, within these stakeholder groups in sometimes some very interesting ways, okay? And so I got really interested in this set of votes that the PJM stakeholders took several years ago on the rules for this capacity market, okay, which remember is very controversial, but is also one of the main tools that the RTO uses to make sure we have a reliable power grid, okay? And so there were basically the stakeholders, okay, produced 6 ideas, proposals, okay, for reforming the rules of the capacity market, okay? One of which was don't change anything and let's keep it the way it's been running for the past number of years, okay? The stakeholders in PJM voted down every single one, including do nothing and keep everything the way it was, okay, all right? And this spurred the equivalent of a constitutional crisis in PJM because the PJM staff basically said, holy smokes, like, right, you know, like we need to have rules, okay, but the stakeholders have just voted down every single set of rules, okay? In the end, what PJM did, right, was they basically sort of exercised eminent domain over their own stakeholder process, okay? And they came up with their own proposal and went to FERC with it and basically said, please approve this or we're gonna be in big trouble and we'll figure out our stakeholder problem, okay? So, and PJM has now spent the past, over the past decade trying to basically deal with reforms to its stakeholder process around the capacity market, okay? What basically, so I found the situation so fascinating, okay? And it made me wonder why the stakeholders were allowed to put themselves in this position where they could literally not do anything, right? Okay. I also found it sort of interesting that basically the set of rules that PJM brought to FERC and had approved, okay, I guess I'll say like, you know, particularly generous to power plant operators, okay, right? And like looked like a huge windfall for the power plants. On the other hand, it was also the proposal that would have basically given PJM like the biggest reliability margin, right? And of course, they're petrified about having a blackout. Okay, so I'll leave you all to speculate about their incentives. And so, you know, I mean, in the paper, I sort of basically did some modeling of some alternative voting systems based around the idea of preferential voting, okay, where you basically have to make a decision, right? And you know what the modeling suggested is that because of the makeup of the stakeholder group in PJM, sort of like no matter which flavor of preferential voting you wanted to throw at it, okay, the outcome there would have actually been very different, right? And would have reflected the preferences of a very different set of stakeholders, right? Where you know you would have gotten rules that didn't have as high a cost, but also didn't come with the same level of like reliability margin, right? And so whether that's good or bad, I don't want to necessarily speculate, but it is different. So
good.
Yeah.
Why do the white areas not belong to an RTO?
They do not belong to an RTO because the utilities there did not want to subject themselves to federal jurisdiction. Okay, I have to put an asterisk next to this, okay, because you'll see that Texas has an RTO, okay? The RTO in Texas is actually not subject to federal regulation. It's regulated entirely by the state of Texas, okay? And this actually goes back to a treaty that was signed like a zillion years ago, basically, you know, basically removing the federal government from jurisdiction over the Texas energy sector. So I do want to save time for questions, and I've talked for way too long, and
There's a lot to cover.
You should have shut me up
No,
way
there's a
early.
lot to cover, and I think a lot of questions have to be sort of based on.
Yeah.
So let's open up the queue. I know I have tons of questions, but the tradition and please are gonna start, and then I'll speak the in-person queue.
I'll check out on.
Might ask you. Thanks. All right, go for it.
I'm interested in this central organizing principle of reliability. And I'm curious if you see any opportunity for other values or goals to come alongside reliability or replace it? And I'm also curious, like, where that desire for what is underlining making reliability basically the super value of the RTO?
Okay.
Resilience, right?
Yeah.
So the answer to your question is like super short and to the point. The answer to your question is much more interesting. Okay. The focus on reliability, really goes all the way back to the Federal Power Act, okay, which basically, it sets out the kind of regulatory landscape for the electric utility industry. The primacy or supremacy of reliability, like as the goal, really stems from like the 1965 North American blackout. At the time, it was the biggest blackout in like the history of the world. Okay. And so following the blackout, okay, the federal government was so furious about this, right, because it was so economically and socially disruptive that they basically told the utility industry that they were going to step in and be a much heavier-handed regulator. Okay, and the industry said no, like we can fix this problem ourselves, right? We will, and they created this standards organization which still exists, right, called NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Council, right? And it was, but I mean that blackout was really sort of like the watershed event. Okay, and then there was another big blackout in the Northeast in 2003, right? That really cemented reliability as the main thing, because after that, following that, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, I think, basically gave FERC the ability to penalize utilities or RTOs that didn't meet reliability standards. Okay, now, that being said, like there is language in the Federal Power Act that refers to cost. Okay. All right. So there's language in the Federal Power Act that says electricity costs must be with the language is just and reasonable. Okay. The question about like climate or environmental quality there's nothing in the Federal Power Act about that. And so for that to be sort of lifted up to the same level as reliability, right? Except in a place like California, which is different in that it does a lot by statute that other areas can't or don't do. That's basically what you would need. The resilience thing is really interesting because reliability is a thing in the electricity industry that everybody understands. Like there's a definition of it, everybody understands it, right? Resilience, nobody understands, right? And they don't know how to operationalize it. They don't know how to measure it. And so this is a very active conversation. But, in our society, reliable electricity is important, right? We saw this in Texas a few years ago, right? Like if you lose your power, people can die. This is, it's not a joke. So it is really important. And how to, how to balance that objective with other possible objectives it's a complicated, important, and evolving thing. So I don't have the answer.
Charlie? Or do you want to go? I think you were first. Okay, go ahead, Charlie.
Seth, really fascinating. I'm Charlie Schweik. I'm a faculty visiting here from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thanks for being here. I was fascinated by, you talked about the cluster, the three on the East Coast. And then as I tracked it, and I'm sorry, I haven't read your paper. So you were talking about the stakeholder voting process in PJM and then you said you did the analysis of different voting approaches and yeah, so yeah, it's just fascinating. It sounded to me like New York and New England also have similar stakeholder systems. So have you done anything comparatively? Because it seems like you've got a really interesting comparative case here to look at. And I know the dependent variable might be different. There may be different voting. What are they voting on and what is the outcomes? But could there be things to be learned from the New England case or the New York case that would inform the PJM case?
Two finger on that, because one of the things that's interesting, especially is the particular voting public choice measure, like strategy that you're using here, rely on a sort of presupposition about agenda setting that might differ very much based on who constitutes a stakeholder. And so in the three up there, that might be shared, which you kind of suggested, right? But like, I'd be curious, you might then be able to learn something really interesting about the relative value of the voting rule versus agenda setting power.
Yeah. Yes, that is super important. And so I mean, to get to your direct question, so there's like in the so in the paper, there's a little kind of comparative stuff around around the emergence of different coalitions, okay, within the stakeholder groups in these RTOs, right? So the other thing I forgot to advertise before everybody runs away is that with these three RTOs, there's an incredible amount of voting data, right? That for every rule or everything that the full body of stakeholders votes on, okay, the RTOs collect and publish data on what the issue was, who showed up to vote, right, how they voted, and it's a really rich data set. So it needs to be updated a little bit, but one of the things that I have done through the RTO governance network is I've taken all of this data for a little over a decade from these three RTOs and have put it on the web. So it's easier to get at. So if you want to know where it is, just let me know. I can point you to it. Okay. But one of the things, one of the things we've done is to take all this voting data, right, and use it to basically build sort of social networks for voting, right? And so you can basically see kind of which constituencies tend to vote with each other more frequently than others, right? And some of it's super predictable, like in like PJM, for example, like all of the end users of electricity are like a super tight voting block, okay? The generators, the suppliers are not, which was really surprising, right? And you don't quite see the same thing in New York, for example. Like there isn't that sort of tight coalition, okay? And where this is relevant to your agenda setting question is that, is that once an issue gets to the full stakeholder body, okay, then, in PJM, the demand, the demand side, the customer side has an incredible amount of power. And they can and do basically kill things that they don't like, okay? But the process of sort of producing the proposals in the first place, right, where actually you could argue is more important and the data that the RTOs produce is not really that good, okay? That process looks like it's much more dominated by the supply side, right? So it's right, and this gets to your agenda setting question, okay? Because being an effective stakeholder in these markets, it's like a full-time job, right? I mean, it really like just the number of like meetings you have to go to and time you have to allocate. I mean, and so there's right, and so you not only have kind of different actors that vote different ways, right? But I also had a student a couple of years ago, right, write his thesis on participation rates, right? And so you have like certain sets of actors who are largely like the power generators and the transmission owners that are like at every single meeting, right? And they're like really involved. And there are others which are like renewable developers and kind of more customer side people that don't actually go to very many meetings and are not as involved, right? So there's kind of that's kind of where the agenda setting happens. And then in the Midwestern RTOs, so in the Southwest Power Pool and in the MISO, right, the states are much more important actors, right? And they're not sort of voting stakeholders, okay? But you know, in those, so in the northeastern states, okay, as part of this whole process of like industry restructuring, the states themselves gave up a lot of regulatory authority in the northeastern states and in California. Okay, in California, they eventually took it back after the energy crisis in 2000. Okay, but like the Midwestern states did basically the state regulators still have a lot more influence, okay, than they do in say Pennsylvania, right? And so, you know, kind of because of those kind of different state approaches to industry reform, right? In the Midwest, basically the state regulators are involved in a lot more of that agenda setting, okay, than in PJM or New York or New England.
Okay, we have like 3 questions and we're almost done. What I'd love to do is the lightning round. That's okay. So I think we had Dan and then Scott and then you the final word, but of course we have lunch and continued discussion. So that is not the actual final word. All right.
So hi, I'm Brenda Bushhouse. I'm a visiting scholar from University of Massachusetts Amherst. I was curious about getting back to the reliability question. Is that if you're going to shift, would it have to be a legislative change, or because there's enabling language that has certain requirements that led to reliability, right? But what about FERC guidelines? What powers do they have to be able to change that? Particularly, I'm thinking about all the push for net zero. So, and then you just mentioned that the renewable stakeholders aren't very powerful or don't really participate as much. So I'm just kind of interested in the larger social dilemma of shifting towards renewable sources. And with this complicated institutional arrangement, was there anything in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act that would help with this? Or I'm just kind of curious about this, where the change can happen.
Yeah.
Can I quick the other 2 and then respond? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, great. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is about the polycentricity aspect of this, and particularly how does this system relate to the two big federal distribution authorities, TVA and Bonneville?
Okay.
And just really briefly on Brenda's point, I mean, FERC has been ratcheting up their guidance for cybersecurity and regulatory requirements, which is kind of part of resilience. So I'm kind of wondering how that could factor in. And then just really briefly, we just put in a Department of Energy proposal with MISO. So happy to chat about that. Okay. But it was a fun process, and it included not only regional stuff, but the community, like the blockchain enabled microgrids.
Oh, cool.
Stuff that's going on. Very neat. We're talking about voting, right? So we can nerd out about that too over lunch if you're interested. Okay. But yeah, on the resilience point, maybe in Brenda's, that'd be good.
Okay. Okay. So Bonneville and TVA are, I mean, they're technically outside of FERC jurisdiction. Okay. So basically, so if they were to hypothetically be an RTO, say in the Pacific Northwest, okay, then you'd have to have some kind of like MOU or something like that organizationally, right? And TVA would basically be the same thing, right?
But they don't so far. They
do. They don't. I mean,
because right, Bonneville actually has some stuff in Northern California. Is that the very white spot at the top of California?
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, Bonneville, they are a participant in basically in the California ISO markets because California, you know, they have to import 30% of their power from other states. Okay. And so, you know, Bonneville basically has to follow the rules of the California ISO market if it's going to sell into California. Okay. But it's, you know,
super interesting.
Yeah, but they themselves don't have to subject their transmission or anything like that to FERC jurisdiction, right? So I mean, as to your question about like what would empower FERC? I mean, FERC's authority comes from the Federal Power Act, right? And so you would have to have something in the Federal Power Act that basically gave FERC jurisdiction over climate or environmental quality or something like that. Right now, their jurisdiction is pretty limited, right? And so like FERC, for example, could not impose a carbon price, right? They could not impose a national portfolio standard for low carbon technology, right? They can't do that. If an RTO wanted to do that, and if they could convince FERC that they could do it in a manner that did not threaten reliability and did not make electric costs unjust or unreasonable, FERC wouldn't say no, I don't think, but FERC can't really give them that guidance right now. The one thing, so one positive thing about the RTO structure, right, is that one of FERC's pieces of FERC's governance guidance is that these organizations are supposed to be kind of technology non-discriminatory, right? And so, they can't say no to a solar farm just because they happen to not like solar farms, right? And there have been a lot of issues with kind of basically the pace of connecting renewable energy to the grid through all of the RTO processes, okay? But there isn't anything explicitly exclusionary, okay? Now, that being said, all of these market rules and stuff, right? I mean, they're super important in how different technologies are valued, right? And so remember, like the rules for those markets come out of these weird stakeholder processes, right? And so it's a little bit difficult to sort of look at the data and tease out really broad things, right? But we've been able to tell stories about, how like renewable energy is valued more in New England than it is in PJM, right? About how kind of the process of like integrating energy storage into these markets has been really like facilitated by the governance process in California and has been really thwarted by the governance process in PJM, right? So with like the RTO governance project, ultimately what we're trying to do is understand like the kind of these connections between like governance choices and outcomes, right? Like how do these governance choices matter? Do they even matter, right? And so, it's tough to kind of come up with like a single unifying analysis of all of this stuff, but there's, if you look at it from different angles and in different places, you can start to tell a bunch of stories, which ultimately are coming together to tell us some things about how we would need to reform governance processes.
Please join me in thanking Seth. Next door, feel free to grab some, bring it back in here and continue the conversation. I think there's much more to talk about here. So I hope that happens, but thank you.
Thank you. Should I get out of the Zoom thing?
Oh, we can deal with it. No worries. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.